Good morning, everyone. This is Valdi van Reenen, Leroux, and I am doing Disrupting Violence, Vlog 7. And I think today, given that it is June the 16th, it is apt to do a blog on education and what is happening under COVID-19 lockdown. So this particular vlog is looking at back to school under COVID-19 conditions. And undoubtedly, education plays a critical role in the socio-economic development of any nation. And nobody needs to be reminded of the social inequalities and the social injustices that our youth throughout the generations have suffered. And this is not a Braai Day. It's a youth day to commemorate our youth's contribution to our liberation, to our democracy. And it is a democracy that is often scoffed at, because we continuously hear people saying, apartheid was better. Yeah, that's what we sometimes say. And when we look at the student protests, the students of 76 and earlier, right up to the 90s, the emphasis was on apartheid. And here's the thing, guys. We may have dismantled apartheid through a legal process, but we've just taken those laws away. Apartheid still very much exists in what we would call neo-apartheid, new forms of apartheid. And the difference is that you now no longer have a law that says this is an apartheid. This is been done during apartheid. I do want that to bluff. This dog is very racist. Dog only barks at black people. You will not say. But anyway, just come back to education. So, our policies, our education policies coming from our Constitution speaks to the issues of access and participation and success. So from basic education, you need to jump to post-school education and training in the various forms. Beautiful pieces of legislation on these issues. Beautiful legislation that is sometimes not implemented as it should. So here we are under lockdown conditions and with a lot of debate, a lot of strife, a lot of conflict around whether schools should be open or not. And everybody feels that they have been marginalized, they have been made to be the perpetrators. Everybody feels that they are the victims of what has happened. And, one of the policies that the Department of Education has is called, firstly, there's a white paper on inclusive education. that came out in 2001, like that's 6. And then later, the Department of Basic Education in 2014 brought out another paper, another policy on how we should deal with barriers to learning. So a barrier to learning is when a child cannot learn because of maybe a disability, a learning disability, maybe a psychosocial issue like poverty, violence, okay? So they have a policy on that. But the unfortunate reality is that these policies are not implemented at the time of lockdown, COVID-19 lockdown. Now, whether you decided to send your child to school or whether you decided to keep your child at home, whether you as a teacher decided that you will go back to school, or whether you decided in solidarity that you were going to stay home, all parties are impacted from a psychological point of view. All parties are having to deal with fear, anxiety, aggression, all of those things, including our students. It is a difficult time for us. And it takes us back. It takes me as an activist who was in the 70s and 80s very vocal at school. It takes me back to that time as we celebrate June the 16th today. What is our reality? Our reality, as the media has shared with us, is that, in the past 48, 72 hours, teachers have died, learners have died, learners have been tested positive, teachers and principals have been tested positive, and we know that whether you're a teacher or whether you're a student, you need to go back home. Now, if you're going back home with the potential of having caught the virus, then what is the implication of that? More people will then be found positive because of the virus. More people who chose not to take their children to school, to keep their children at home, will also be affected. Because the parents who took their children to school and the children who came back home and then go to shopping, to do shopping, may very well to run, they may very well pass on the virus to those very same people who decided not to send their children to school. So I want to start off by saying that we are all affected in one way or the other. And I also want to say to you that I am a former educator, a former curriculum advisor, and for a while I sat at head office in town where I was an acting deputy specialist for history. So I know the education system vetterig. I know the education system well. And I know why I left the education system. Precisely for this kind of thinking. Where we believe that education, to educate someone, can only come from teaching content. And as a former curriculum specialist in history, I try to figure out why our history teachers on the Cape Flats at our disadvantaged schools were not coping, and our schools on the Golden Mile, as we called them, were coping. And I realized what Bruce Perry speaks to. He's a psychologist, and he writes quite a bit on education and neuroscience and the brain and why people don't learn or can't learn or find difficulty in learning. And it all has to do with your brain growth, with your exposure to violence, your exposure to trauma, and how that impacts upon you. And when I look at what a number of countries are doing, I've now read a lot of WhatsApp posts of parents complaining about the amount of homework. And, I also have done quite a bit of research on other countries' education systems. And I want to tell you, and some of you are going to be clapping your hands, but you must advocate for this. In a country like Finland, if you are in primary school, you don't get homework. Your homework is to do an act of kindness. So their children are taught from a very, very young age emotional intelligence, which is so much needed for a child to learn, especially a child that is growing up in a family or a community affected by violence. So when we look at the statistics of students, parents, and even teachers, principals, and others exposed to the virus and being tested positive, and some even dying, was it all necessary? The fact that we were affected by the virus because of the Department of Basic Education being headstrong, that people will go back to school no matter what, is a violent act. And it is a violent act that could have been prevented, because so many of us predicted that this will happen. So when we say that violence is predictable, and we say that it is prevented, which is the words of the World Health Organization, you see it very clearly within education. Now, the department shuts down the school because it is not ready for teaching and learning. You shut it down on the basis of no toilets, no water, the need that the school needs to be cleaned. All very valid and necessary. The toilets, that is non-existent, the pit toilets, where children have already died. All necessary. Necessary to put in toilets. Necessary to have access to water. But you don't think it's necessary, as the education department, to consider the mental health well-being of people. of teachers, of principals, of admin staff, of learners, of parents. You don't see that as a necessity. Now, those people who are judging parents who decided to take their children to school, bear in mind, put yourself in the shoes of that child that is having to learn in this new normal, social distancing. We were then 60 the other day in the class. We were then 40 in the class. Now we a smaller group. And we're not realizing the impact of fear and anxiety and stress on our learners that need to now go back to school because that is what mommy and daddy say. And we're not realizing the anxiety and stress that children who would have wanted to go to school, but who cannot go back to school because that is the decision that mom and dad has made. We cannot see, we cannot empathize with them because they too feel anxious and fearful and feel that they're missing out. And our reality is that in terms of access, you can go to any school you want if you are able to get in and if you have the money. And you can participate in education. You can be part of extramurals. But as the one student whose parents decided to send her to school, as she said to us, when the journalist asked her, "What are you missing?" And she said, "Our extramural activities, because we can't do sports." That broke my heart. It broke my heart. We think that children only learn through being in a classroom. And if they don't go to class, and if they are not taught by a teacher that went to university or college, if they gain learning through other forms, it's not valid. It's nonsense. It's nonsense. Winston Churchill did not complete his schooling, but he became the Prime Minister of a country. So I am wanting to, on this day, just remember those who have fought for our country, our youth, and our youth that are continuing to struggle with the injustices of the past. I'm going to end there